Every atrocity in history had an audience. Genocides, lynchings, ethnic cleansing, internment camps, forced removals. People watched. People participated. People looked away. The question that keeps me up at night isn't how could they? It's how did ordinary people become convinced that extraordinary cruelty was acceptable? Because nobody wakes up one morning believing an entire group of people deserves fewer rights. Nobody wakes up and decides their neighbor is less human than they are. Something happens first. A story gets planted. A fear gets introduced. And us and a them begins to take shape. Then the story gets repeated over and over until the unbelievable becomes believable, until the believable becomes familiar, until the familiar feels like common sense. And once something feels like common sense, people stop asking for evidence. They stop asking who benefits. They stop asking who wrote the story in the first place. That's where today's investigation begins. Welcome to You Oughta Know Betta. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. And this is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Today we're putting one thing on trial. Not a political party, not a president, not a media outlet. A narrative. Because before history records the atrocity, it almost always records the story that made the atrocity seem reasonable. Today we're asking a question that matters far more than which side you're on politically. Who taught us to believe what we believe? Because our opinions don't appear out of thin air. They're shaped by family, school, community, church, books, television, headlines, politicians. And the stories were told over and over and over again until they no longer feel like stories. They feel like truth. Political scientist Harold Lasswell, one of the pioneers of communication research, once described propaganda as the management of collective attitudes through the manipulation of significant symbols. Edward Bernays later argued that modern societies are influenced by the conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions. That's just a complicated way of saying simple. If you can shape the story, you can shape what people believe. And if you can shape what people believe, you can shape what they're willing to accept. Today we're exploring an idea called manufactured consent. Not because people are mindless, not because people are incapable of thinking for themselves, but because every one of us, including me, is influenced by the information we're exposed to and the way those stories are framed. This isn't an episode about blaming people. It's an episode about understanding people. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that dangerous ideas rarely arrive wearing a name tag that says dangerous. They usually arrive disguised as common sense. So let's read the fine print. Let's check the receipts. And let's investigate the asterisk. Because you ought to know better. Now, before we can understand manufactured consent, we have to understand and answer a much simpler question. Where do our beliefs come from? Most of us like to believe we arrived at our opinions through logic. We looked at the facts, we weighed the evidence, then we made up our minds. Sometimes that's true. But psychology tells us that's only part of the story. Long before we were ever able to cast votes, long before we debated politics online, long before we even understood what government was, our brains were already learning how to make sense of the world. As children, we absorb information from the people we trust the most. Our parents, grandparents, teachers, preachers, friends, movies, TV, and of course, social media. None of these things are inherently bad. To be honest, they're how every culture passes down its values. But they also shape what feels normal. Think about it. If every movie you watch portrayed one group as heroes and another as criminals, eventually you stop noticing the pattern. If every history class tells the same version of events, you begin to assume that's simply what happened. If every news story introduces certain communities only during crime reports, your brain starts connecting those ideas automatically, even if no one ever says them out loud. Psychologists call them schemas. They're mental shortcuts. Our brains create them because processing every new piece of information from scratch would be exhausting. Schemas help us move through the world efficiently, but efficiency has a downside. Once a schema is established, our brains naturally pay more attention to information that confirms it than information that challenges it. That's called confirmation bias. It doesn't make you unintelligent, it makes you human. We all do it. I do it, you do it, everyone does. The question isn't whether we're influenced. The question is whether we're willing to notice when it's happening. Because once a story becomes familiar, it stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like reality. And that's exactly where manufactured consent begins. Not with lies, not even with propaganda, but with repetition. The same messages, images, assumptions, repeated so consistently that questioning them starts to feel weird. That's when stories become beliefs and beliefs become policies. Because governments don't usually create public opinion from nothing. They work with stories that people already find believable. The real power isn't convincing millions of people to believe something outrageous overnight. The real power is making one small idea seem reasonable, then building on it. One headline, one speech, one classroom, one campaign, one conversation, one story at a time. Until the extraordinary no longer feels extraordinary at all. And history has revealed that process has happened over and over and over again. Not just in one country or under one ideology, but across centuries. So before we examine the mechanics of manufactured consent, let's look at its history. History is a habit of repeating itself. Not because people never learn, but because the methods keep working. If I asked you how one group of people convinces another group to support injustice, most of us would imagine a dictator standing behind a podium. But history tells us a different story. Long before the violence, there was a narrative. Long before the law or the story changed. Take Nazi Germany. Most people know about the Holocaust. Fewer people know about what came first. Years before the concentration camps, the Nazi government flooded newspapers, classrooms, children's books, movies, radio broadcast with one message: the Jewish people were dangerous, that they controlled banks and media, that they were responsible for Germany's problems. The goal wasn't to convince everyone overnight. It was to make those ideas feel familiar. Because once enough people accepted the premise, the policies became easier to justify. History shows this pattern over and over again. During the Rwandan genocide, radio broadcasts repeatedly referred to Tutsis as cockroaches. That wasn't an accident. Language matters. Because it's much easier to harm someone after you've convinced yourself they're less than fully human. Here in the United States, we've seen similar patterns. Before the forced removal of indigenous people, Americans were taught that westward expansion was civilization, not displacement, not broken treaties, not the destruction of entire nations. Civilization. Before Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps during World War II, political leaders and newspapers repeatedly framed them as potential security threats, despite the absence of evidence that the community as a whole posed such a danger. We also saw Donald Trump, who said that Mexicans were rapists, drug dealers, criminals. In 2016, they now sit in detention centers across the United States because the story was repeated. Fear became the story. The story became policy. And policy changed thousands of lives. The same thing happened before segregation, before lynchings, before the Chinese Exclusion Act, before countless moments in history that we now look back on with disbelief. The details change, the targets change, the slogans change, the rhetoric changes, but the process is extremely consistent. First, create fear. Then, repeat fear. Finally, present extraordinary actions as the only reasonable solution. Notice something? None of these examples required every citizen to become hateful. They only required enough people to stop questioning the narrative. That's an important distinction. Manufactured consent doesn't require unanimous agreement. It requires enough acceptance, enough silence, enough indifference. That resistance becomes the exception instead of the rule. And that's why studying history matters. Not to shame ourselves for the past, but to recognize the pattern before it repeats itself. Because history doesn't only teach us what happened, it teaches us how it happened. And once you understand the process, you start noticing it everywhere. Not just in governments, not in media alone, but in advertising, in politics, public relations, social movements, corporations. Anywhere people are trying to shape what millions of others believe. Which brings us to a man most people have never heard of, but whose ideas quietly transformed the modern world. Edward Bernays. If you've never heard that name before, by the end of this episode, you'll understand why some people call him the father of public relations, and why others believe he helped write the playbook for manufacturing consent. If you're sitting there thinking, I would have never fallen for that, I get it. I used to think the same thing. We all like to believe we're too smart, too educated, too skeptical, too independent. But that's not how persuasion works. The people most vulnerable to influence aren't always the least intelligent. Sometimes they're the most confident that they can't be influenced. Because manufactured consent doesn't work by turning off your brain. It works by working with your brain. Let's talk about Edward Bernays. You've probably never heard his name, but you've almost certainly experienced his influence. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. While Freud studied the unconscious mind, Bernays asked a different question. What if those unconscious desires could be used to persuade millions of people? He believed people rarely made decisions based on logic alone. We buy because something makes us feel successful, safe, accepted, powerful, free. Then our brains come along afterward and explain why the decision was rational. Bernays called public relations the engineering of consent. Think about those words. Engineering, consent. Not forcing people, not threatening people. Shaping the environment so people willingly arrive at the conclusion you hope they'd reach. One of his most famous campaigns happened in the 1920s. At the time, it was considered socially unacceptable for many women to smoke cigarettes in public. That wasn't good for cigarette sales. So Bernays didn't argue that cigarettes were healthy. He didn't need to. Instead, he worked with activists and staged a publicity event during the New York City's Easter Parade. Women lit cigarettes in public while photographers captured the moment. The cigarettes were described as the torches of freedom. The message wasn't about tobacco. It was about independence, equality, and liberation. Whether or not that campaign reflected the broader goals of the women's rights movement is a question historians still discuss, still debate. But it demonstrated something important. People weren't being sold nicotine. They were being sold a story. And stories are powerful. Because once an object becomes attached to an identity, it stops being just an object. The same principle works in politics. Sometimes we're not voting for a policy. We're voting for what that policy says about us. Sometimes we're not defending evidence. We're defending our identity. Our brains don't just process facts. They process belonging. Psychologists found that people often evaluate information through the lens of the groups they identify with. That doesn't mean facts stop mattering. It means identity can shape which facts we notice, trust, or question. That's true whether you're a conservative, a liberal, independent, religious, atheist, black, white, rich, poor. None of us are exempt. Because before we're political, we're human. And that's exactly why manufactured consent is so effective. It doesn't ask us to stop thinking. It asks us to stop questioning the story we've already accepted. So if stories shape beliefs and beliefs shape public opinion, who decides which stories get repeated? That's where we have to talk about institutions, the news, entertainment, algorithms, political campaigns, and the incentives that determine which stories rise to the top and which ones quietly disappear. Because the loudest story isn't always the most accurate. Sometimes it's simply the most profitable. Let's try an experiment. Think about the biggest political story you heard this week. Now ask yourself another question. Who decided it was the biggest story? Most of us assume the news simply reflects reality. Something important happens, the media reports it, we react. But communication researchers spent decades studying that assumption. And what they found is more complicated. The media doesn't usually tell us what to think, but it has tremendous influence over what we think about. Researchers call this agenda setting. Imagine walking into a grocery store, thousands of products in this store, but only a handful are placed at eye level. Those aren't necessarily the best products. They're the products someone decided you should notice first. Information works the same way. Every single day, thousands of events happen around the world. Most never become headlines. Some receive 30 seconds of coverage. Others dominate the news cycle for weeks. That doesn't automatically mean there's a conspiracy. News organizations have limited time, limited space, limited staff. Editors make decisions. Producers make decisions. Algorithms make decisions. Social media platforms make decisions. Every decision about what gets amplified is also a decision about what receives less attention. Then there are incentives. Most news organizations aren't charities, they're businesses. Businesses need viewers, subscribers, clicks, advertising revenue. That doesn't mean reporters are inventing stories. It means they operate inside a system that rewards attention. And what captures attention? Novelty, conflict, fear, outrage, urgency. Psychologists call this negativity bias. Human beings naturally pay more attention to threats than neutral information. Thousands of years ago, that tendency helped keep us alive. The person who noticed the danger survived. The person who ignored it didn't. Today, that same brain is scrolling through headlines, and it still can't resist a threat. That's why you might remember 10 alarming headlines and completely forget the quiet story about a policy that actually changed your life. Our brains aren't broken. They're doing exactly what they've evolved to do. The challenge is that modern media understands this. Algorithms, advertisers, political campaigns, they all compete for the same thing: your attention. Because attention has become one of the most valuable resources in the world. If someone can consistently earn your attention, they gain opportunities to shape what you notice, what you ignore, what you fear, and sometimes what you believe. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean every journalist is manipulating the public. It doesn't mean every social media platform has a secret agenda. Sometimes a story dominates simply because it's genuinely important. Sometimes the evidence is overwhelming. The point isn't that everything is manipulation. The point is that every institution has incentives. And if we never ask what those incentives are, we may confuse popularity with importance, or repetition with truth. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Maybe the most powerful form of manufactured consent isn't censorship. Maybe it's something much quieter. Not forcing people to look away. Just giving them so much to look at that they never notice what's missing. Because once you understand how attention works, you begin to realize that influence isn't only about what is said. Sometimes it's about how it's said. The words we choose, the labels we repeat, the metaphors we never question. Because language doesn't just describe reality. Sometimes it creates it. At this point, you might be wondering, so what am I supposed to do? Just trust nobody? No. That's not only impossible, it's unhealthy. None of us has the time to personally investigate every scientific study, every court case, government report, historical event. We all rely on experts. The real question isn't whether we'll trust someone. It's how we decide who deserves that trust. Critical thinking isn't refusing to believe anything. It's refusing to stop asking questions. Questions like, who benefits from this message? What evidence supports it? What evidence challenges it? What information am I not seeing? Could there be another explanation? Those questions don't make you cynical. They make you curious. And curiosity is one of the best defenses against manipulation. Because propaganda doesn't just rely on misinformation. Sometimes it relies on certainty. The feeling that there's nothing left to learn, nothing left to question, nothing left to investigate. But history tells us that certainty has often been the companion of injustice. The people who defended slavery were certain. The people who defended segregation were certain. The people who opposed women voting were certain. The people who defended Japanese internment believed they were protecting the country. Certainty isn't proof. It's a feeling. Evidence is proof. And those are two very different things. One of the most valuable habits you can develop is learning to separate those two. When you hear a claim, ask yourself, what would convince me that I'm wrong? If the answer is nothing, then you've stopped investigating. You've started defending, and there's a difference. The goal isn't to become someone who changes their mind every 5 minutes. The goal is to become someone who can change their mind when the evidence changes. That's not weakness. That's intellectual honesty. Some of the smartest people in history changed their minds. Scientists revise theories. Judges overturn precedents. Historians reinterpret evidence when new documents are discovered. Growth isn't a sign that you were foolish before. It's a sign that you're still learning. So maybe the opposite of manufactured consent isn't skepticism. Maybe it's humility. The willingness to say, I don't know enough yet. Let me keep reading. Let me hear the other side. Show me the evidence. Those aren't signs of indecision. They're signs of confidence. Because confident people don't fear questions. Only fragile ideas do. And maybe that's the biggest lesson history has to offer. The greatest threat to democracy isn't disagreement. It's a population that stops asking questions altogether. Because every generation inherits stories. The question is, which ones will we choose to pass on? We covered a lot today. We talked about history, psychology, propaganda, media, politics. But none of those were my point. My point was something much simpler. Stories shape societies. Every nation tells stories about itself. Every family does, every religion, every political movement, every culture. Stories teach us who belong, who don't. Who deserves protection, who deserves suspicion, who's a hero, who's a villain. And every generation has a responsibility to ask, are these stories true? Not because questioning everything is noble, but because history has shown us what happens when nobody asks. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today's episode, it's this. The most dangerous ideas rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They usually arrive wrapped in words like security, tradition, freedom, order, progress, justice, patriotism. None of those words are bad. In fact, they're values worth protecting. But values can also be used to justify harm when we stop asking what they actually mean or who gets to define them. Manufactured consent isn't about convincing people to believe obvious lies. It's about making one version of reality feel so familiar that alternatives stop feeling possible. That's why democracy depends on more than elections. It depends on curiosity, debate, evidence. It depends on people who are willing to ask one more question before sharing a headline, before accepting a stereotype, before deciding that an entire group of people can be explained in a single sentence. Because human beings have never fit neatly into simple stories. And maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe the antidote to manufactured consent isn't refusing to trust anyone. Maybe it's refusing to surrender to your curiosity. Read the article, not just the headline. Open the study, not just the quote. Listen to people who challenge you, not because they're always right, but because they might ask you a question you forgot to ask yourself. If today's episode made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort isn't the enemy of learning. It's usually the beginning of it. And if today's episode made you curious, even better. Because curiosity has a way of breaking narratives open. Before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. The next time you hear someone say everyone knows, or people like them always, or that's just the way things are, pause for a second and ask one more question. Who benefits if I believe this story? Not because every story is false, but because every important story deserves to be examined. That's all we're trying to do here. Read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. And this has been You Oughta Know Betta. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never let someone else do all of your thinking for you. Good night.